If a people have lived long enough in one place, she said, and if there is enough love there, I believe something comes out of the people and remains in the land.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a podcast brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation and hosted by noted writer Lyman, who has chronicled the stories, culture, and character of Utah's Dixie for more than 40 years.
Today, it's just Ricky and me here in the studio, and I want to share something that I've been thinking about for a long time that I've wanted to share with our Not Forgotten audience about someone really special and really important. And I thought the way I would approach this is to start by sharing a chapter from my book, Where Two Streams Meet. And I want Ricky to listen closely to this story. And then I'm going to have a couple of questions for him when I finish. And then I'm hoping that he'll have some questions for me, and we will take it from there. This is a piece called Dreams That Live and Linger. Once upon a time, a bright young miss wrote a book. It was a big novel about her small hometown, and it was the story of a peculiar people, an epic of life, death, joy, heartache, love, hate, courage, and fear. The book became a national bestseller, and the girl's name appeared in all the most important newspapers and all the great magazines of the land. She traveled to Boston and New York. She climbed to the top of the Statue of Liberty and kicked through the snow of Central Park. People stopped her on the street and said, "Aren't you the lady who wrote the book?" Then she came home. Her name was not in the hometown paper. People did not stop her on the street. And though she lived a long and full life in that town, it was not the happily ever after that once upon a time stories are supposed to end with. The bright young miss, Maurine Whipple, in her brilliant novel of the settlement of St. George, entitled The Giant Joshua, were simply 50 years ahead of their time. When I heard about Maurine Whipple's death in St. George on April 12, 1992, I went straight to my files and pulled out several pages of handwritten notes I had taken during a half-dozen visits with Maurine while she resided at the Meadows Care Facility in the mid-1980s. I was surprised at how much she had told me and how candid she had been. As I read back through the notes, I smiled at her mention of my grandfather, who had been one of her teachers at Dixie. She recalled walking into the post office on Tabernacle Street one day soon after the book came out. Some of the old-timers avoided her, but she recalled how my grandfather walked up to her there in the post office lobby and shared a warm compliment about her writing. "That little moment meant more to me than I can express," she said. Maurine Whipple, who was born in St. George in 1903, was never conventional, never one of the crowd, never status quo. Beginning in her early childhood, she walked her own path, a path that led up along the ridge of the Red Hill to the top of the Sugarloaf, where a wide-eyed, open-minded girl could drink in the beauty and mystery of a jagged desert landscape. Born to a pioneer Latter-day Saint family, she inherited an innate love for the place of her roots. But she was also born with a not-so-common urge, a passion to know and understand and interpret everything around her. It's likely this quirk, this internal burning to perceive and to communicate, was the distinguishing factor that set her apart from the crowd and put her on the road to fame and controversy. "I love this country with an indefinable passion," she told me during one of our visits. "All my life, I've longed for those red, red hills. One of my fondest and earliest memories is of Christmas Day on the Sugarloaf." As a young girl, Maurine began the obsessive task of writing her impressions and attempting to express her feelings about the land and people around her. "I started writing at age 4, she said, as soon as I learned my letters. Talents began to surface. Talents in poetry, prose, song, and dance. As the daughter of a hard-working lumberyard operator, one might not have expected much family support for an intellectual and artistic child, but Maurine said she was never steered away from her interests, but rather encouraged by her family to seek further education. "My father was very artistic," Maurine said, "but he never had the time or the opportunity to use his talents." Childhood presented Maurine with its usual joy and tragedy. "I went through all the hard things children do," she said. "I went to primary and I went to church and I wrote all my experiences in poems and stories. One is led to believe that possibly the most important tragedy in young Maurine's life was losing a coveted literary prize at Dixie High School. She'd been made to understand that the prize was hers, but when the award was announced, it went to another girl. Maurine was devastated. Dreams that live and linger with hope as a dear desire, dreams that branch and blossom." She recited those lines to me as we visited one day, lines possibly written at that poignant point in her life, a poem she could not quite remember. The experience of losing might have had something to do with Maurine's picking up and taking off to college at the University of Utah. She had graduated from Dixie High School in 1922, and this was a serious move, foregoing Dixie College for the other institution up north. For the observer looking back, it was a symbolic move, a kind of breaking with tradition, an unconventional act which typified the rest of Maurine Whipple's life. It was at the University of Utah where Maurine's eyes were opened to the great world around her. There she learned her trade, practiced her art, charted her course, and set out to make her mark on the world. She was 18 years old when she left her home for the first time. "My father was determined that I go to college," she recalled. She stuffed 2 skirts and 3 midi blouses in a suitcase and got in the car with a Mrs. Hartog. "I kept calling her Mrs. Warthog," Maurine remembered. She did not know where she was to get off, did not know a soul in Salt Lake City. "She let me out of the car somewhere in Salt Lake City, and there I stood alone." Once Maurine found the university, there was no problem finding her place in the system. She said she majored in English, speech, play acting, dancing, and physical education. Being there was like sitting at a great gourmet dinner, everything placed before you, and you wanted all of it. She supported herself through 4 years of college by washing baby diapers. "It was a market that never dried up," she chuckled. She also taught tap dancing lessons, a talent she had developed as a child and one that helped support her through much of her early adulthood. "I loved the university," she said. "To this day, I can still smell the apple brown Betsy they served in the cafeteria. It smelled to heaven, and it made my mouth water, but I never could afford it." The A's came easily, but the dates and the dances were few. She wrote poems about how she longed to be pretty and popular. "I always wrote what I felt," she said. "I wrote a lot of awful stuff in college, but I've never allowed my name to be put on anything that was not true." After graduating from the University of Utah with honors, Maurine worked the summer for the National Park Service at the Grand Canyon's North Rim. Then she began a short school teaching career, first teaching English in Monroe, Utah, then moving north to Heber City, then to Boulder City, Nevada, where the dam was under construction, and she taught dancing to the wives and children of the workmen. I was young and small and looked a lot more fragile than I was, she recalled, but I've never been scared in my life. Kids never scared me. They treated me well. She recalled her last teaching job in the cold little community of Georgetown, Idaho, where she came down with appendicitis and recuperated in Montpelier, where there was steam heat. 50 years had faded her memory, and it may never be possible to document the exact evolution of Maurine Whipple's famous book, but one must assume the novel began germinating in a young schoolgirl's mind and started to sprout in a little steam-heated room in Montpelier, Idaho. Maybe it was there that Maurine left her teaching career behind and took up the cross of a professional writer. That sponge-like perception of her girlhood landscape had equipped Maurine with the tools to begin. She had known and continued to converse with original pioneers of the Dixie mission. Her friend, Juanita Brooks, would supply crucial historical information. The rest would branch and blossom from an imagination as fertile and creative as ever emerged from Latter-day Saint culture. My mind teemed with things I wanted to write, she remembered. I lay awake nights under heavy quilts and wrote into the wee hours until my arm hurt so bad I'd have to put a heat pad on it. Most of the writing was done in St. George. She remembered a wild apricot tree out her window and how she loved to watch the birds in the tree as she wrote. She learned during those tedious long hours that writing, for her, required a kind of self-hypnosis. I had to go inside myself to the point that I was almost unaware of the world going on around me. She would doodle until everything else was blocked out, then write. After writing, I'd hike up the red hill, roam the rocks, and climb to the top of the Sugarloaf. I remember seeing a Gila monster on one of those excursions. I'd walk the length of the red hill, down to the old highway, then back to town. She loved to walk down to the sandy edge of the Virgin River, study its endless flow, and watch how the water jumped its banks and imagine the pioneers' often futile attempts to dam the stream. Those places, the Red Hill and the Virgin River, loom large as characters in the landscape of the giant Joshua. The writing was laborious and draining. I can remember the sound of my dad's saw as I'd struggle to get things written right, she said. An editor at Houghton Mifflin Publishing Company in Boston had read some of Maurine's work. He encouraged her to enter her novel in progress in the company's contest for new writers. It was a sizzling June day in Utah's Dixie when Maurine Whipple received a telegram phoned in from Cedar City informing her that she had won the Houghton Mifflin Writing Fellowship. From that point on, she had the encouragement and the help of professionals as she completed the manuscript and prepared it for publication, which was guaranteed as a result of the prize. The man from Houghton Mifflin said I was the first writer who ever gave him the feeling that coming west had anything to offer, she recalled. She didn't realize until later what a prestigious award she had won. Her writing was selected over thousands of other entries. Looking back, Maurine said she really didn't know how to write a book at the time. She had jumped into the project with nothing but a topic, some raw materials, and an incessant desire to write. I'd go to the printers and get mill ends, big pieces of paper, and sketch my characters on those sheets. I was accused of copying characters out of history, and indeed some of the characters in the book are people who actually lived and carry their real names. But the main characters of Clorinda, Abijah, Sheba, and Free are not copied from any true living characters, she said. She'd take a character such as Abijah and sketch him on one of her mill ends. I'd write all his qualities and characteristics on that sheet, and then I'd show how he would change through the years, the color of his beard, the wrinkles, and other things. She did this with each character, and eventually each one came alive in her. The man from Houghton Mifflin told me I had an ability to throw myself into a situation and make it come alive, she said. But he wasn't pleased with some of the names in the book. He wanted a name for Clorinda that wasn't romantic. Clorinda was a name I had stumbled onto, and I liked it very much. He finally consented to Clory because he thought it had strength. He'd make me name each character with just the right name before he let me go on. The publisher invited Maurine to Boston before the book was finished. I'm the only St. George native I know of who rode the train round trip to Boston and lived to tell about it, she chuckled. Using part of the $1,500 prize she won, which was also an advance on the royalties for her forthcoming book, Maurine set out for the East. There was something wonderful about New England, she said. The Whipples are originally from there, and the publisher took me to the Whipple House in Boston. She stayed at the publisher's house on Beacon Hill and spent time at a summer house on Ipswich Bay. I stayed in a charming room with a canopy bed and didn't ever want to leave, she recalled. I didn't have the clothes for all this, and I was on display. Luckily, I'd found a dark blue-green dress with white dots and gloves and hat at Penny's for $10 before I left. The maid pressed it for me each morning. For 2 weeks, she went fishing every day and conferred with the publisher about her book. He couldn't understand that I didn't have money, and he said he'd like to come out west sometime when the Indian scare was over. Before going home, Maurine visited the Houghton Mifflin offices in New York as well. I remember walking down Fifth Avenue, all the stores full of flowers. I stayed in a beautiful hotel, but hung on to every cent I could. Never ashamed, she said. I was what I was, and I was always proud. The original draft of The Giant Joshua, according to Maurine, was written entirely in longhand, and it stretched to the incredible length of 400,000 words. She claimed they hired the best cutter in the United States to cut the manuscript in half, and he said he couldn't cut a word out of it. The story was too interwoven, she said. She had written as tightly as she felt she could. Her editor had told her the way to find out if writing was tight was to throw a pencil at the page, and if the sentence bled, it was tight. Finally, they asked me to cut it. They gave me just a few days to cut the manuscript from 400,000 to 200,000 words. I always believed that you wrote what was called for. If a complete sentence was called for, then I wrote it. But if a fragment did the job, that was sufficient. The book finally appeared in 1941. It was the epic story of a 17-year-old Latter-day Saint pioneer girl, her life in a polygamous family set in the St. George Valley, and it graphically chronicled the struggles of a religiously motivated people and their daily lives under the hot Dixie sun. It was a story of passion and dashed hopes, love and fierce hatred, family and neighborhood relationships, righteousness and self-righteousness. More than anything, the book was a gritty and real look at the everyday life of pioneering, an attempt to objectively portray what such an existence was really like, in a way that sterile history could never achieve. Maurine pulled no punches and told it like it must have been, told it in more graphic detail than it had ever been told before. The response was phenomenal. The book became a bestseller. It was reviewed in the New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco newspapers. Maurine's picture appeared in Saturday Review. The book was touted in Time magazine. By the time Maurine made her second trip to the East Coast, she was a celebrity, known on the streets, the darling of autograph parties, balcony seats at Broadway shows, and eventually the book was translated into 11 languages. But back home, the response was subdued. As the journalist LeVar Webb later wrote, she had muddied the cultural waters that spawned her. The book was taken personally by some St. George natives who saw their progenitors painted with a not-so-white brush. They read things into the book that I didn't write, Maurine later said. Dr. Charles Peterson, a noted writer and Utah State University history professor, said Maurine Whipple had written a book 50 years ahead of its time. Literature scholars, both inside and out of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, touted the book as a realistic look at early Latter-day Saint life. And, in fact, the book has been called by many the best Latter-day Saint fiction ever written. Transcending the literary category of local color, Maurine's book caught the fancy of readers all over the country. She received more than 3,000 letters from admiring readers. The author, who never did realize great financial rewards from the book, once said, "I'd give all those nice words for $5." A Look magazine editor told her the book made him think Latter-day Saints are a wonderful people. Encouraging words came from all across the country, but few such words came from home. In the preface to The Giant Joshua, written in October of 1940, Maurine pleaded with her readers, "These people of whom I write are my people, and I love them. It's natural for our generation to deify them, to lack a sense of humor regarding those who could not have survived without humor. But I believe we detract from their achievement when we paint them with too white a brush." In the early 1980s, the renowned novelist and historian Wallace Stegner said Maurine Whipple was the only writer who had successfully gotten away with writing a good Mormon novel. The best of the Mormon novels, Stegner said, are such stories as Vardis Fisher's Children of God, which is simply the historical story told as a novel, or Maurine Whipple's Giant Joshua, which is a settlement novel with Mormon context. It's the matter of settlement that makes it an interesting novel. The kind of crisis which the land itself produces interact with some others which doctrine or political conflict produce. Maurine did her job the best she could, and it was more than good enough for her national audience. She went on the lecture circuit, saying, "Giving a speech is like having a baby. It's much easier to conceive than deliver," and began writing for national magazines like Collier's and Saturday Evening Post. "You write like an angel," wrote a California editor of Collier's in a telegram to Maurine. "Come on down." One of her most famous magazine articles was a treatise on the modern polygamy situation in what was then called Short Creek, now Colorado City, Arizona, which appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. Another popular piece appearing in Collier's was on the search for Montezuma's treasure near Kanab, Utah. She was one of the first writers in the country to report on the atomic testing at the Nevada test site. Another book emerged in 1947, a title released by Alfred Knopf Company in conjunction with the Latter-day Saint Centennial in Utah. It was called This is the Place, Utah. a nonfiction work dealing with the history of the Mormons in Utah. Maurine Whipple never published another novel. Oh yes, her mind brewed and her pencils ground down to stumps, but she apparently hit her peak with the giant Joshua. She told me she originally planned a trilogy with the giant Joshua as the first in a series of 3 books. Jim, she said, who was about 12 at the end of Joshua, would end up on the Arizona Strip as a cowboy, she explained. That would be number 2, and number 3 would bring us to the present. But those books remained locked in the author's mind and never found their way out. I always wanted to write a cowboy book, said Maurine. I love Louis L'Amour, and I love all the old stories of the Arizona Strip. She knew the legendary Bill Shanley of the Strip and others like Slim Waring. Her early memories went back to summer visits to her uncle's ranch near Pioche, Nevada, and she even wrote a story about the Beaver Dam Wash, way back before the giant Joshua. She claimed that manuscript, as well as other precious papers, books, notes, letters, and heirlooms, were stolen when her home was ransacked a few years earlier. Yet, many of her papers have been preserved at Brigham Young University. An in-depth biography of Maurine Whipple by Vita Tebbs Hale, entitled Swell Suffering, was published in 2011. I don't own a copy of The Giant Joshua, Maurine told me during our last visit in the mid-1980s. In the past, I've lent copies out and they've never come back. In spite of financial difficulties and her inability to ever finish another novel, Maurine Whipple's love affair with her home landscape and its history continued until her death in the spring of 1992. The years had crept up on her, but she still searched for that elusive definition of who and what we are in this bright, rugged corner of Utah. And she still talked of finishing another novel. She did not want to rest until she had captured the hardy pioneer spirit of Dixie and the essence of the pink afterglow on the red sandstone cliffs at sundown. If a people have lived long enough in one place, she said, and if there is enough love there, I believe something comes out of the people and remains in the land. That was a little longer piece than I thought it was going to be. I haven't returned to that in a long time. Ricky, my first question for you is, have you ever heard of Maurine Whipple?
I don't think, at least not concretely, that I would remember.
And that's very telling. But it's also, I would imagine, very common, especially among many of our listeners. Yeah. It's just amazing to think that there was a New York Times bestselling author that was born in St. George, grew up here, and in 1941 published a novel with an East Coast publisher, and that novel became a best-selling book.
Yeah. Was Juanita Brooks before her?
And that's a very interesting thing. And I anticipated that question because I think that might be one of the first questions that a lot of our listeners would ask. Mm-hmm. Because we talked about Juanita Brooks in a previous episode. And Juanita and Maurine are both amazing women who did amazing things, but were completely different.
Yeah, I kind of wondered as you were reading if Juanita was maybe a little bit older as a mentor or if they were right on the same...
I think Juanita was maybe a little bit older, but they were basically contemporaries. Juanita Brooks was doing her work and becoming a legendary historian, while Maurine Whipple was trying to find her place in this world as a novelist. Yeah. And those are very different things. And the interesting thing about it is that Juanita Brooks, she was the one who did the heavy lifting of really documenting and bringing together and beautifully writing the history of this area. And then Maurine was able to take that raw material and work it into a novel.
But what's interesting to me is that, well, I haven't read the book, The Giant Joshua, but it sounds like it's close enough to fact and historical events and people that some of the people in the area felt defamed or they didn't like some of the portrayals. But at the same time, it's a novel, so there's fictional characters in there. So that's something I'm curious about, how she did that.
And that's the interesting thing, because, again, Juanita Brooks documented history and wrote it beautifully. And then Maurine took history, and history is like the skeleton, and then she put the flesh on the skeleton. But what she did in putting the flesh on the skeleton is made it very carnal. And that's the thing that was so hard, because we're talking about a time when polygamy was part of this culture, and polygamy was not an easy thing. And if you imagine the family dynamics and the situations, especially that a young woman like Chloe, who was the main character in The Giant Joshua, the situation she found herself in, Maurine didn't pull any punches there. She told it the way she imagined that it would have been. And so she didn't sugarcoat anything. And in some ways, I think you could say that she made sure that she included some of the lurid stuff that maybe another author would have been more subtle about. And so it was hard for the local folks here, because she really was writing about their grandparents and great-grandparents. The interesting thing, though, is that those key characters really were based on her grandparents. And so...
The fictional characters?
Yes, to some degree. And so she's writing about her own ancestors, but she's fictionalized them. And that's a really hard thing to do, to be true to the faith aspect, but also she was focused on telling it like it was. And she did that in such a way that it was very hard for the local folks here to accept, because they really did feel that she was really exposing things that were private and that really are hard to understand or to share without a full context of the spiritual and doctrinal aspects of it all. Maurine was a free spirit. She was born in the church and she grew up. Her parents were a pioneer Latter-day Saint stock, but she had a sense of telling that story the way it was. And you have to admire her for that, and I do admire her for that. But at the same time, you have to wonder, did she in some ways betray her people? Because the same story could be told without going quite as far as she did with some things.
One question, so the timeline, were her parents polygamous or grandparents?
Her grandparents.
Okay, so that was in her family line the last.
Yes. And her parents, they were church members, but they weren't the devout type of church members that many other people in the community were in that generation. Mm-hmm. And then Maurine, she became her own person. And I think that she always had a sense of love for the restored Church of Jesus Christ, but it wasn't paramount for her through most of her life. I do know that at the end of her life, she came full circle in her beliefs and in her devotion to her faith. And I knew her at that time, and that's when I met her. She was in her 80s when I met her. I went to her apartment at the Meadows here in St. George and had long visits with her on several occasions. I wish I would have recorded those visits, but she was tentative about that. She said, "You can take notes." That's how I did it. I took notes. You don't need to record me. And so I have pages and pages of notes, but I never did get to record her.
That kind of makes me curious about another question. I don't know if she has personal vulnerability, like exposing herself You mentioned how when she was writing, she gets into a self-hypnosis state. So you're not really thinking about your inhibitions about what you would say to get the words out. And I wonder if the vulnerability was more about her grandparents or others, or if she was personally letting herself be exposed as well in her writings.
She was happy to talk about everything. She talked openly about her life. There is pathos in her life that, if you read her biography, it's just a long series of really sad and difficult things that she went through. She married once in the 1930s, and that marriage lasted just a few months. And other than that, she was single all her life. But there were many men that she had relationships with that she hoped to marry, and then those things never happened. There was a lot of sadness and discouragement, and also just the idea that she was a single woman on her own and never really did have much financial stability. In fact, much of her life was really a struggle to get a little money here or there. And she wrote magazine articles in the 50s that helped her along. But by the time the 80s rolled around and she was an older woman, she was not in a very good position and didn't have a lot of support system. Although she had extended family that were there for her. But the way she shared it with me is that I'm here at the Meadows because finally somebody bought the screen rights to the Giant Joshua. And I think that late in her life, there was a bit of a windfall there that allowed her to have a comfortable situation in her later years. She also had some really wonderful people that were caregivers and helpers and people that were with her. She was very open, and in the visits that I had with her, it was almost like I was there as a therapist because she was telling me all these sad things that had happened in her life and how she dearly wanted to write the sequel or even the two more novels that she had in her mind for that trilogy. And yet that first book was published in 1941, and here we are in the 1980s, and she's still saying, I'm going to write that next book. And those were things that just made my heart ache because I knew that just couldn't and wouldn't happen. And yet that's what she yearned for, was to be able to finish that work. There's a lot of really good things that have been written about her life that really get at what it was that kept her from finishing what she originally planned. But she always had the Giant Joshua to fall back on. She did that, and it was amazing. And being a writer myself, I looked at her and thought, here is someone who really did this, who dreamed something and it happened. And I know how hard that is. I've had one book published in New York with my novel for young readers called Over the Joshua Slope. And that just took years of effort and networking and trying to get in. And finally, it was published by Macmillan. Ironically, by the time it came out, it was Simon & Schuster because the publishing world was shifting at that time. And I thought, okay, I've made it now, and now I'm going to write a lot of books that will be published in New York. But I never was able to publish another there. Breaking through there is an amazingly difficult thing, and that's why I had such admiration for Maurine, because she did it. And she did it out of nowhere.
Do you happen to know how, if she shared when she started conceiving the ideas for the book from that point until it was finalized? I'm just curious, how old she was. And
I can't document that, but in the reading that I've done and in the visits that I had with her, I think that the idea for the Giant Joshua began when she was a little girl walking on the Red Hill. And she had this sense of telling the story of this town, of this community, and how it was settled, and what it must have been like to live at that time. But then as she graduated from college and began teaching, she taught, and then she was disenchanted with teaching, and then she got ill, and then during that illness, that's where she decided she was going to start writing. And so she had actually written a novella, a short novel. It was called Beaver Dam Wash, and I don't know a lot about it. Apparently, it was one of those manuscripts that got stolen when her house was ransacked later in life. But the whole idea of the stories of the Beaver Dam Wash and those people is something that I've been really fascinated with all my life, because that's where, in that general area, is where we have wintered our cattle traditionally. And I've known that area really well. And it's funny because when I was visiting with Maurine, this was mid-1980s, one day she said, "Lyman, would you take me out to the Beaver Dam Wash?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'd love to take you out to the Beaver Dam Wash." And she wasn't completely housebound there. She could get up and walk. And so we planned the day, and I talked to Debbie about it. I said, "I'm going to take a woman out to the Beaver Dam Wash." That was an interesting situation. But I got Maurine into my pickup, and we drove out Highway 91 over the old Utah Hill and dropped down to the turnoff toward what's now called Lytle Ranch, and drove out to the Beaver Dam Wash. One of the reasons Maurine wanted to go is because there are a lot of Joshua trees out there, and she had written that story about the Beaver Dam Wash. And what a lady. We just had this amazing drive, and she's talking to me all the way out, and we go to the Lytle Ranch, which was then and now owned by Brigham Young University, and it's a research area. And we drove in to the compound down into the Beaver Dam Wash area, and the caretaker for BYU was there, and he came out. And when I introduced him to Maurine Whipple, he was just dumbfounded. He couldn't believe that Maurine Whipple, number one, was still alive, number two, was right there in front of him. And we just had a great visit that day, and I really treasure that. But for me, it's not so much the novel of Giant Joshua, because I don't necessarily recommend it to people. I think people ought to read it, but I'm not the one recommending it. Okay? Does that make sense?
I get that, yeah.
And people react to it in different ways. But there's so much in the book that can really help you get a deeper sense of what it was to live here and to be here at that time. And I have the greatest respect and admiration for Juanita Brooks, first and foremost, and what she did and how she did it. But in that same vein, I have this respect and appreciation and honor for Maurine for what she accomplished in really putting some flesh on the bones of history of this area. Maybe I could give you a little sample.
Yeah, I'd like to hear.
I'm just going random here. Here's page 135. At last, civilization was timidly abroad over the land, across scatterings of stone arrowheads, of lava or pale flint rock, pieces of traced pottery and hidden graves with their baskets, beads, and swathed bones. Settlers were plowing, always with the cautious gun on the beam. Fields planted to cotton, to corn and grain and sugar cane soon wore a faint dusting of green. Step by step, this fierce and ancient land, so old it was new and virgin, grudgingly acknowledged its latest conquerors. For it was not to be thought that this land, so vast and bitter and brooding, would be easy to subjugate, would ever be taken without a struggle. Sometimes at night, when the sod turned, surprised red bellies up to a wide and glittering sky, a defiant spirit seemed to ride the echoes with the coyote chorus. You there, you, man, who planned to tame the great basin of North America, I am the very rim of the basin. Nothing has ever prepared you for the life I'll lead you. Keep on your guard. Keep your eyes open. I'll fight you with heat and cold and drought and pestilence, rattlesnakes and scorpions, Gila monsters. If you think you have me beat on your right hand, look out for your left. I have no sense of honor. I strike in the dark behind your back. That's the mid-20th century novel, the way that she wrote. And obviously there's nothing about character or plot there. That was just more of a description of the landscape, setting the stage. So let me just share another piece here from page 322. When Glory came running at Free's call, she snatched the child from his arms and shut her eyes against the fresh fierceness of her hate for such a country. He smiled at her gently. She reached out a hand and clung to him for a moment. Oh, not that he meant anything to her, and the touch of his skin completely stampeded her senses. Illogically, maddeningly, she could not speak at all, but only gazed at his burned face and neck, his brows and hair bleached tow-white by the sun, his light eyes all tenderness for her again. The desert, he mumbled inarticulately, wetting his lips. It was even better than we thought. The ground changes to orange out there, and the mountains are the color of fresh killed beef. And then the ground is gray again, and the wildflowers start. You'd love the wildflowers. And Death Valley, where the mountains are like purple grapes, and the air is so clear you could reach out and pick them off with your hand. And the Joshua trees? Did you see the Joshuas? She asked faintly, lost in the shining of his eyes. Yes, whole forests, some young fellers with flowers at the ends of their arms, and others so old and crippled, like giants with the rheumatiz. But still pointing toward the promised land, she said, so softly he had to stoop to hear, her eyes so full of the vistas they had explored together, that it did not matter. She had never even been to Santa Clara. So this is Free, her stepson, because she's the third wife of Abijah, and Freeborn is the son of one of his other wives. But they're pretty close to the same age, and they have feelings for each other. And he has had the opportunity to go to California and see what's there and come back. And the symbolism of the giant Joshua is that it stands out there with its arms pointed like Joshua toward the promised land. And for a lot of the folks who came to St. George, they came to St. George because it was part of the promised land. But for a lot of folks who lacked faith, they saw that giant Joshua pointing toward California, and they felt like that was the promised land. And there were a lot of the folks who originally came here who, after a few years, got tired of it and went on to California. You can read history, but in a novel, there's the imagery and the human pathos that goes with it. And she really did a great job of that. It's just that she maybe did too good a job for a lot of the folks who had lived here. She said, perhaps, therefore, it's natural for our generation to deify them, perhaps because of the abuse they suffered for over half a century. It is natural for us, even now, to carry a chip on our shoulder toward the world, to lack a sense of humor regarding those who could not have survived without humor. But I believe we detract from their achievement when we paint them with too wide a brush. These people of whom I write are my people, and I love them. But I believe that what they did becomes even greater when we face the fact that they were human beings by birth and only saints by adoption. And so that's her approach of telling it like it was and feeling like they deserve no less than to have us know what it like it was. And in that same vein, you turn to Juanita Brooks, and she said things very similarly. Like she said, nothing but the truth can be good enough for the church to which I belong. And so when it came to things like the Mountain Meadows Massacre, she was not interested in telling that story except completely truthfully. And that's from the academic historic perspective. And Maurine wanted to tell the story truthfully from the novelistic perspective. And in both cases, both of those amazing women faced a lot of controversy because they did tell it the way they saw it. And I sometimes wonder if Maurine Whipple might have come away from this a little easier if she had been more like her contemporary, William Faulkner. He was writing at the same time, and he was writing about the South, and he was writing about controversial race and slavery and issues that were very sensitive to the people of the South. But what he did is he created his own county, Yoknapatawpha County, and it was a completely fictionalized world that he wrote in. He wrote truthfully and realistically and novelistically about the people, but he did it in a separate world. And Maurine, she wrote about St. George, and she changed the names, but it was very obvious who everyone was. And she didn't change all the names. She wrote about Brigham Young. She wrote about Erastus Snow. She wrote about many of the key historic figures, but the key dramatic figures in the book, she changed the names, but they were basically people that the local folks could recognize, oh, that's so-and-so. It's also interesting to consider that Maurine Whipple was born about the same time as Margaret Mitchell. And Margaret Mitchell was a granddaughter of people of the South, just as Maurine was a granddaughter of people of St. George. And Margaret Mitchell's characters in Gone with the Wind lived through the changing times of the last half of the 1800s during that great moral dilemma of slavery. And Maurine's people lived through the same time period, but instead of struggling with the old social structure of the South, they were experimenting with a new structure and one that contained a new moral dilemma, and that was polygamy. And so it's interesting to think that at about the same time that Margaret Mitchell was writing Gone with the Wind, there was a young woman in St. George writing the story of the settlement of this area. Not what you would expect, that a girl that grew up in St. George and in the circumstances in which she grew up would eventually become a best-selling author.
Both Juanita and Maurine, it seems that their works brought attention and awareness to the area that otherwise wouldn't have from outsiders, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe more attention from outsiders than from insiders.
Yeah, and if you read what the critics have written over the years, the people who are not part of this culture reacted much more positively to these stories because it was so close to our hearts. But what's totally amazing to me is that in the mid part of the 1900s, two such amazing women set themselves apart from the world by being who they were. And they were both born right here in Utah's Dixie. They both grew up in this culture, and then they told the stories, and they transcended all of that by becoming known nationally and internationally.
Makes you wonder how many other Maurine Whipples and Juanita Brooks are 8, 9, 10 years old right now in this area, ready to make their mark on the world.
Isn't that awesome to think? Isn't that awesome to think? So In the introduction to another book called A Craving for Beauty, the collected writings of Maurine Whipple, there's some wonderful pieces of interpretation about Maurine and her life in the introductions to the different pieces that are collected in this book. This was actually written by Vida Tebbs Hale, who wrote Maurine's biography. Through the years, as she was writing and struggling with various health issues and problems in her family, Maurine would occasionally add to her Joshua sequel. It was entitled Cleave the Wood. The 5 chapters included in this collection are set in the 1890s, about 6 years after the end of the giant Joshua. They focus on the children and grandchildren of Clory, Abijah, and the other pioneers who carried on the building of the city of St. George and the great spirit of cooperation and brotherhood behind it. The existing 5 chapters reflect the talents of this gifted novelist and stir wistful feelings in the reader. The story of another generation of Dixie pioneers would surely have been a welcome bonus for Mormon letters. Whipple lamented her inability to finish the sequel. "I tried too hard," she said at the end of her life, "and I just couldn't get it done. Had I written the sequel, my characters, the grandchildren of Clory, would have seen all the world had to offer and come back to the ideals their forefathers reached for. The fact that the giant Joshua is still in print after all these years and still taught in university literature courses is a testament to its quality and timeliness and a tribute to Maurine Whipple, its author." So, Ricky, there's so much more we could cover. What folks need to do is become familiar with who she was and what she accomplished in her life. There was that tinge in my heart when she told me that she didn't own a copy of the giant Joshua. And I did. And on one of the occasions that I sat down with her, I asked her if she would sign my book. And I'm just going to read what she wrote here, and we'll end with that. She wrote, St. George, Utah, June 24th, 1986, to Lyman Hafen, who is a person after my own heart. Long may you wave. Sincerely and with affection, Maurine.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. The hot winds whirl around me and take away my breath. I've had the with trees. If this desert's gonna blossom, I'd better plant the seeds. 'Cause they'll come to Dixie, and they'll call it home. Oh, in Dixie, they live and grow. They'll come to Dixie, and they'll call it home. Oh, in Dixie, they live